He was a titan of Wall Street, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in the most exclusive boardrooms. She was his radiant, heavily pregnant wife, the envy of every socialite in New York City. Their life was a carefully curated masterpiece of wealth and power, a modern-day fairy tale. But one careless, cruel phrase, uttered amidst the pastel-colored innocence of a luxury baby boutique, shattered the illusion. "You're just the womb." He sneered, his voice laced with a casual disdain that was more chilling than any shout. By midnight, that single sentence had ignited a firestorm that would not only burn their fairy tale to the ground, but would also see a judge utter the unprecedented words, "Parental rights revoked." This is the story of how one woman armed with nothing but the truth and a mother's ferocious love brought a king to his knees. Evelyn Dubois had always known she was living a life most people could only dream of. Her husband, Damien Thorne, was not just wealthy. He was a dynasty. The Thorne name was etched onto skyscrapers, emblazoned on philanthropic wings of museums, and whispered in the hallowed halls of finance. Their penthouse apartment on Park Avenue offered a panoramic view of a city that seemed to bow to his will. The air she breathed was thick with the scent of fresh-cut flowers, flown in daily from Holland, and her closets overflowed with couture that had never been, and likely never would be, worn by anyone else. Their love story, at least the version told to the glossy pages of magazines, was one for the ages. The brilliant self-made billionaire, captivated by the ethereal beauty and sharp mind of the art curator. Damien had pursued her with a relentless, all-consuming passion that had at first been intoxicating. He had showered her with gifts, whisked her away to private islands on a whim, and made her feel like the center of his universe. When she had told him she was pregnant, he had thrown a lavish party that was the talk of the season, a public declaration of his joy and pride. But as the months of her pregnancy wore on, a subtle but undeniable shift had occurred. Damien's initial ecstasy had curdled into something else, something she couldn't quite name, but that left a bitter taste in her mouth. His attention, once a warm and comforting sunbeam, now felt like a spotlight scrutinizing her every move, every pound gained, every moment of fatigue. He had become obsessed with the Thorne air, a phrase he used with increasing frequency, while "our baby" seemed to have been erased from his vocabulary. The pregnancy itself had been difficult, a far cry from the serene, glowing experience depicted in the magazines that now featured her on their covers. She had been plagued by severe morning sickness, debilitating fatigue, and a host of other ailments that had left her feeling like a stranger in her own body. Damien's reaction to her struggles had been one of thinly veiled impatience. He had hired a team of the best doctors, nutritionists, and prenatal specialists money could buy. Not, she was beginning to suspect, out of a deep concern for her well-being, but to ensure the vessel carrying his legacy was functioning optimally. The day it all shattered began like any other in their gilded cage. Evelyn had awoken to the soft hum of the city below, and the sight of Damien already dressed in a bespoke suit, talking animatedly on his phone, his back to her. He didn't say goodbye, merely gestured to the breakfast tray a silent maid had placed on her bedside table. Later that day, her personal shopper, a woman with a perpetually strained smile named Celeste, arrived to take her to Bon Point, an exclusive baby boutique on Madison Avenue. Damien was to meet them there, a rare concession in his tightly packed schedule. The boutique was a symphony of creams and pastels, a place so achingly perfect it felt more like a museum than a store. Tiny cashmere sweaters were displayed like precious jewels, and handcrafted wooden toys sat on shelves waiting for the touch of a privileged child. Evelyn, her body feeling heavy and cumbersome, walked through the aisles trying to muster a spark of the excitement she was supposed to be feeling. But a sense of dread had settled deep in her bones. Damien arrived in a whirlwind of self-importance, his phone still pressed to his ear. He ended the call with a curt "Sell," and turned to Evelyn, his smile not quite reaching his cold blue eyes. "All right, let's get this done. I have a meeting at 4. He strode through the store with the air of a man conquering new territory, dismissing Evelyn's tentative suggestions with a wave of his hand. "No, not that one. The fabric looks cheap," he said of a soft, organic cotton onesie. "This is for a thorn Evelyn not for just anyone." The comment stung, but she bit her tongue, a habit she had perfected over the years of their marriage. They moved to the furniture section, a collection of cribs and changing tables that cost more than most people's cars. Evelyn's heart ached for a simple wooden crib she had seen online, a warm, unpretentious piece that felt like home. But Damien was drawn to a monstrosity of a crib, an ornate, gilded affair that looked like it belonged in a palace. "This is it," he declared, running a hand over the gilded acanthus leaf carvings. "Strong, regal. It makes a statement." "Damien, it's a bit much, isn't it?" Evelyn ventured, her voice barely a whisper. "It looks so cold. I was hoping for something cozier." Damien turned to her, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of the charming billionaire slipped, revealing a sneer of such profound contempt that it stole her breath. "Cozy. We're not raising a dormouse, Evelyn. We're raising a successor, an heir. This is about legacy, not sentimentality." It was then that Celeste, the ever-present shopper, made the mistake of intervening. Perhaps a compromise, the Marie Antoinette bassinet is quite popular. It's elegant, but still has a certain sweetness. Damien didn't even glance at Celeste. His eyes were locked on Evelyn, a cold fin burning in their depths. And then he said the words that would echo in her mind for years to come, the words that would sever the last fraying thread of her love for him. "Her opinion is irrelevant," he said, his voice low and menacing. "She's just the womb, a vessel. Her job is almost done. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to take this call." He turned his back on her, pulling his phone from his pocket, and walked away, already immersed in the world of high-stakes deals and billion-dollar mergers. The air in the boutique, once filled with the promise of new life, suddenly felt thick and suffocating. The pastel colors seemed to mock her, the tiny clothes a painful reminder of the future she had once so eagerly anticipated. Evelyn stood frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. "Just a womb." The words ricocheted around her skull, each syllable a fresh blow. It wasn't just the cruelty of the statement. It was the casual, unthinking way he had said it, as if it were an undeniable fact. In that moment, she saw him for what he truly was. A man who saw her not as a partner, not as the mother of his child, but as an incubator, a means to an end. The love she had once felt for him, a love she had desperately tried to cling to, evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Celeste, her face pale with shock, took a hesitant step towards her. "Mrs. Thorne? Evelyn? Are you all right?" Evelyn looked at the concerned face of the woman she barely knew, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was anger, a pure, cleansing, all-consuming anger. She turned and walked out of the store, leaving behind the gilded crib, the cashmere sweaters, and the man who had just sealed his own fate. By the time she reached the street, the tears were streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of rage. and in her heart a new resolve was forged. He had called her a womb. She would show him the power of a mother. The taxi ride back to the Park Avenue penthouse was a blur. The city, usually a source of comfort and inspiration for Evelyn, now felt alien and hostile. The towering buildings, once symbols of ambition and success, seemed to lean in, suffocating her with their opulence. Every smiling face on a billboard, every advertisement for a happy family felt like a personal affront. She was a woman adrift in a sea of her own, making a fairy tale princess who had just discovered her castle was a prison. When she stepped out of the elevator and into the palatial apartment, the silence was deafening. The scent of fresh lilies, a scent she had once loved, now seemed funereal. She walked through the vast, impersonal rooms, her hand trailing over the cold marble surfaces and the rich, textured fabrics. Everything was a testament to Damien's taste, his wealth, his power. There was nothing of her here, no trace of the woman she had been before she had become Mrs. Thorne. For a long time she simply stood in the center of the living room, her arms wrapped around her swollen belly, a silent promise to the life growing inside her. The anger that had propelled her out of the baby boutique had cooled, replaced by a chilling clarity. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment on Damien's part. It was a revelation. It was the truth of their relationship laid bare under the harsh, fluorescent lights of a children's store. Her mind raced, replaying the countless small slights, the casual dismissals, the moments of cold indifference she had brushed aside, desperate to maintain the illusion of their perfect marriage. She remembered the way he had scoffed when she had expressed a desire to return to work at the art gallery after the baby was born. "A thorn does not work," he had said, as if it were a royal decree. She remembered the prenuptial agreement, a document so thick and complex it had taken her lawyer a week to decipher a document that essentially stripped her of any claim to his fortune, a document she had signed without a second thought, blinded by what she had believed to be love. The sound of the elevator door opening jolted her from her reverie. Damien strode in his face, a mask of irritation. "What the hell was that, Evelyn?" "You walk out on me in the middle of a consultation. You made a scene." Evelyn turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady, devoid of the hysteria he so clearly expected. "You called me a womb." Damien rolled his eyes, a gesture of such profound dismissal that it reignited the embers of her anger. "Oh, for God's sake, don't be so dramatic. It was a figure of speech. You're overly sensitive. It's the hormones." "No, Damien," she said, taking a step towards him, her gaze unwavering. "It wasn't a figure of speech. It was the truth. It's how you see me. It's how you've seen me all along." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "And what if it is? You're carrying my son, my heir. It's the most important job in the world. You should be grateful." The sheer arrogance of his words, the absolute certainty in his belief that he was in the right, was staggering. It was in that moment that Evelyn knew there was no going back. There could be no reconciliation, no apologies, no tearful reunion. Their marriage was a sham, a business transaction in which she was a commodity. "I want a divorce," she said, the words tasting strange and foreign on her tongue. Damien's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. "A divorce? Don't be ridiculous. We're having a baby. You're not going anywhere." He took a step towards her, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You signed a contract, Evelyn. You seem to be forgetting that." "I remember it perfectly." She countered, her own voice laced with a newfound steel. "I also remember that it doesn't give you the right to treat me like a piece of property." He laughed again, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the silent room. "Property, don't flatter yourself. You're an investment, and I always protect my investments." He gestured around the apartment at the priceless art on the walls, the designer furniture, the breathtaking view of the city. "You think you can just walk away from all this? You have nothing, Evelyn. You came to me with nothing, and you'll leave with nothing." "I have my son," she said, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "And that's all I need." A dark cloud passed over Damien's face. "Our son," he corrected her, his voice dangerously soft. "The Thorn heir. And don't you ever forget it. You will not take my son from me." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. But Evelyn was no longer afraid. The fear had been burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated resolve. She had been a fool, blinded by love and luxury. But she was not weak, and she would not allow her child to be raised by a man who saw his own mother as nothing more than a vessel. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice a quiet promise. She turned and walked towards the bedroom, her movements deliberate and calm. She packed a small bag, taking only the things that were truly hers. A faded photograph of her parents, a well-worn book of poetry, the simple gold locket her grandmother had given her. She left behind the diamonds, the couture, the empty trappings of a life that was no longer hers. When she walked back into the living room, Damien was on the phone again, his back to her, his voice a low, angry murmur. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. She simply walked out of the apartment, out of the gilded cage, and into the uncertain future. As the elevator descended, she took a deep breath, the stale, conditioned air of the penthouse replaced by the raw, unfiltered air of the city. She had no money, no plan, and a powerful, ruthless enemy. But for the first time, in a long time, she felt free. The battle for her child, for her own soul, had just begun. By midnight, she had found a small, inconspicuous hotel in a quiet part of the city. Her first call was not to her friends, not to her family, but to a name she had been given by her lawyer at the time of the prenuptial agreement, a name she had been told to remember in case of emergency. Eleanor Vance, a lawyer known for her tenacity, her brilliance, and her unwavering commitment to justice. The game was afoot. Eleanor Vance's office was a stark contrast to the world Evelyn had just left. Located in a modest building in the West Village, it was a space filled with books, files, and the quiet hum of righteous indignation. Eleanor herself was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through to the heart of the matter. She listened to Evelyn's story without interruption, her expression a mixture of empathy and a steely resolve that Evelyn found immensely comforting. "He said that to you?" Eleanor asked, her voice low and laced with a quiet fury, when Evelyn had finished recounting the scene in the baby boutique. In public, Evelyn nodded, the memory still fresh, still painful. "He thinks I'm being overly sensitive, hormonal." Eleanor let out a short, derisive snort. "Of course he does. It's the classic defense of the arrogant, entitled man. Diminish, dismiss, and deny." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Evelyn, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to be a brutal fight. Damien Thorn is not just a rich man. He's a powerful one. He has an army of lawyers who are experts at crushing people like you." "I don't care," Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. "I will not let him raise my son. I will not let my child be taught that women are disposable, that love is a transaction, that money is the only thing that matters." A rare smile touched Eleanor's lips. Good. That's the fire I need to see. Because we're not just going to fight him, Evelyn. We're going to dismantle him. The first salvo in the war was fired by Damien as expected. The day after Evelyn left, she was served with a barrage of legal documents. A petition for sole custody of the unborn child, citing her emotional instability and erratic behavior. A motion to freeze her assets, which she was grimly aware were practically non-existent. A restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of the Park Avenue apartment or any of Damien's offices. It was a classic show of force designed to intimidate and overwhelm. But Eleanor was unfazed. Standard operating procedure for a man like Thorne, she said, scanning the documents with a practiced eye. He's trying to scare you into submission. It won't work. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal maneuvering and strategic planning. Eleanor assembled a small, dedicated team, a group of young, hungry lawyers who were eager to take on the Goliath of the New York legal world. They worked tirelessly, poring over Damien's business dealings, his personal history, his every public statement. They were looking for a chink in his armor, a weakness they could exploit. Meanwhile, Evelyn was living in a state of suspended animation. She had moved into a small, furnished apartment that Eleanor had secured for her, a place so different from the penthouse it felt like another planet. It was small, a little shabby, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of ownership, of belonging. She spent her days walking in the nearby park, reading books on childbirth and parenting, and trying to quiet the storm of anxiety that raged within her. The media, of course, had caught scent of the story. The fairy tale marriage of Damien Thorne and Evelyn Dubois was a staple of the gossip columns, and their sudden acrimonious split was a bonanza. Evelyn was hounded by paparazzi. Her picture plastered on the front pages of tabloids, accompanied by lurid headlines. Billionaire's pregnant wife flees Thorne, heir, at center of bitter custody battle. Evelyn's erratic behavior. What is she hiding? Damien, with his vast resources and his team of public relations experts, was expertly controlling the narrative. He gave a carefully worded interview to a sympathetic journalist, painting himself as the heartbroken husband worried for the well-being of his unstable hormonal wife. He spoke of his deep love for his unborn son, his desire to provide him with a stable, loving home. He was the picture of concerned paternal devotion. It was a brilliant performance, and it was working. Public opinion began to turn against Evelyn. She was portrayed as a gold digger, a spoiled trophy wife who had thrown a tantrum and run away. The online comments were brutal, a torrent of vitriol that left her feeling raw and exposed. "Don't read it," Eleanor advised, her voice firm but kind. "It's poison. It's exactly what he wants. He wants to isolate you, to make you feel like you're alone in this. You're not." But the pressure was immense. Evelyn's own family, who had been so impressed by Damien's wealth and charm, were now urging her to reconcile. "He's a good man, Evelyn," her mother had said over the phone, her voice laced with a mixture of concern and disappointment. "He's just under a lot of stress. All men say stupid things sometimes." It was a lonely, terrifying time. The only thing that kept her going was the steady, rhythmic beat of the tiny heart inside her. She would lie in bed at night, her hands on her belly, and whisper to her unborn son, promising him a life of love and freedom, a life far from the cold, gilded cage of his father's world. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Eleanor's young associates, a whip-smart lawyer named Ben Carter, had been digging into Damien's past, specifically his college years. He had uncovered a story, a rumor really, about a young woman, a fellow student who had been involved with Damien and had left the university abruptly in the middle of a semester. Her name was Catherine Royce. It took weeks of painstaking work to track her down. She was living in a small town in Oregon, a quiet, unassuming woman who worked as a librarian. When Ben finally reached her, she was hesitant to talk the memories of her time with Damien, still painful, still raw. But after much persuasion, she agreed to speak to Eleanor. Catherine's story was chillingly familiar. She had been young, impressionable, and completely captivated by the charismatic, ambitious Damien Thorne. They had had a whirlwind romance, a relationship that had quickly become intense and controlling. And then she had gotten pregnant. Damien's reaction had been swift and brutal. He had denied that the child was his, had accused her of trying to trap him, and had offered her money to take care of the problem. When she had refused, he had launched a campaign of intimidation and harassment, turning their mutual friends against her, spreading vicious rumors, and making her life at the university a living hell. Heartbroken and terrified, she had dropped out of school, had the baby, and had given him up for adoption, desperate to protect him from his father. As Evelyn listened to the recording of Catherine's testimony, a cold dread washed over her. It was as if she were hearing a ghost from her own future. The pattern was undeniable. The charm, the control, the utter ruthlessness when his plans were thwarted. Damien hadn't changed. He had just gotten better at hiding his true nature. "This is it," Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce light. "This is what we needed. This isn't just about a cruel comment in a baby store anymore. This is about a pattern of behavior. This is about a man who believes he has the right to control women, to dispose of them when they become inconvenient." The story of Catherine Royce was a powerful weapon, but it was also a dangerous one. Damien's lawyers would do everything they could to discredit her, to paint her as a bitter, vindictive ex-lover. They needed more. They needed to find a way to expose the Damien Thorne that existed behind the carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, charming billionaire. And so the hunt began. A hunt for the truth, a truth that was buried deep beneath a mountain of wealth, power, and lies. A truth that, if they could uncover it, would not only win Evelyn her freedom, but would also bring a king to his knees. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. The revelation of Catherine Royce's story shifted the dynamic of the case. It was no longer a simple, albeit high-profile divorce and custody battle. It was a potential character assassination, a direct assault on the carefully crafted public image of Damien Thorne. And Damien, as expected, reacted with the ferocity of a cornered animal. His legal team, a veritable who's who of New York's most ruthless litigators, immediately went on the offensive. They filed a motion to have Catherine's testimony thrown out, claiming it was irrelevant and prejudicial. They leaked stories to the press, painting her as a mentally unstable woman with a long-standing grudge against Damien. They even hired private investigators to dig up dirt on her, to find anything that could be used to discredit her. But Eleanor Vance was a master strategist. She had anticipated Damien's moves, and she was ready. She had her own team of investigators, a discreet and highly effective group, who began to look not at Damien's past, but at his present. They focused on his business dealings, the source of his immense wealth and power. For weeks they hit nothing but dead ends. Damien's business empire was a fortress, a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts that seemed impenetrable. But then they found a crack. A disgruntled former employee of Thorne Industries, a man who had been fired for questioning Damien's ethics, was willing to talk. His name was Marcus Thorne, a distant cousin of Damien's who had worked in the company's finance department. He was a quiet, unassuming man, but he had a keen eye for detail and a strong moral compass. He told Eleanor's investigators about a series of creative accounting practices, a system of moving money around that was designed to minimize tax liabilities and hide assets. He didn't have any concrete proof. He had been too low on the corporate ladder for that, but he knew where to look. Armed with this new information, Eleanor filed a motion for discovery, demanding access to Damien's personal and business financial records. It was a bold move, a direct challenge to Damien's most closely guarded secrets. His lawyers fought it tooth and nail, arguing that it was a fishing expedition, a violation of his privacy. But the judge, a shrewd and experienced woman named Maria Rodriguez, was intrigued. She had seen enough of Damien's aggressive legal tactics to suspect there might be more to the story. She granted the motion. It was a turning point in the case. The floodgates were opened, and what poured out was a torrent of a damning information. Eleanor's team of forensic accountants worked around the clock, sifting through thousands of pages of financial documents. What they found was a picture of a man who was not just ruthless in his personal life, but in his professional life as well. They uncovered a pattern of predatory business practices of hostile takeovers that had destroyed small family-owned companies, of shady deals with foreign investors that bordered on illegal. But the most explosive discovery was hidden deep within the labyrinthine structure of his offshore accounts. It was a series of payments, large, regular payments, made to a clinic in a small, discreet European country, a clinic that specialized in genetic research. At first, Eleanor and her team couldn't understand the significance of the payments, but then they cross-referenced the dates of the payments with Damien's personal calendar, which they had also obtained through discovery, and they found a chilling correlation. The payments had begun shortly after Evelyn had announced her pregnancy, and they had been made to a Dr. Alistair Finch, a controversial figure in the world of genetics, a man whose work on genetic perfection had been widely condemned by the scientific community. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Damien's obsession with the Thorne heir, his cold clinical approach to Evelyn's pregnancy, his utter disdain for her as a person. It wasn't just about legacy. It was about control. Absolute, total, and terrifying control. Eleanor knew she had to tread carefully. This was an explosive accusation, and she needed more than just circumstantial evidence. She needed to find a way to connect Damien directly to Dr. Finch, to prove that he was not just a passive investor, but an active participant in a morally repugnant enterprise. The opportunity came during Damien's deposition. It was a tense, grueling affair held in a sterile conference room in Eleanor's office. Damien was the picture of cool, collected arrogance, his answers to Eleanor's questions clipped and dismissive. He denied everything, of course. He barely knew Catherine Royce, he claimed. His business practices were aggressive but legal. He was a victim, a man whose life was being torn apart by a vindictive, unstable woman. For hours, Eleanor chipped away at his defenses, her questions precise and relentless. She lulled him into a false sense of security, asking him about his childhood, his ambitions, his vision for the future of his company. And then, when he was at his most relaxed, his most arrogant, she struck. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "are you familiar with the work of Dr. Alistair Finch?" For the first time that day, a flicker of something not quite fear, but something close to it appeared in Damien's eyes. He recovered quickly, his expression once again a mask of cool indifference. "I'm not sure I know the name." "Really?" Eleanor said, raising an eyebrow. "That's strange, because according to your own financial records, you've paid him over $2 million in the last 6 months. She slid a copy of the bank statements across the table. Damien glanced at them, his jaw tight. "I have many investments. I don't keep track of all of them." "This wasn't an investment," Mr. Thorne. Eleanor pressed on her voice like steel. "This was a fee for services. The services of a man who believes he can create a perfect human being. A man who believes that parents have the right to choose the genetic makeup of their children." "Tell me, Mr. Thorne, what kind of services were you purchasing from Dr. Finch?" Damien's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. A muscle twitched in his cheek. His knuckles were white as he gripped the arms of his chair. "This is outrageous. This has nothing to do with my son." "On the contrary," Eleanor said, her voice rising with a righteous anger. "It has everything to do with your son. You didn't just call your wife a womb, Mr. Thorne. You treated her like one. You saw her. You saw your own child as a science experiment, a project to be managed, controlled, and perfected according to your own twisted specifications. You weren't preparing to be a father. You were preparing to be a god." The room was silent, the only sound the frantic scribbling of the court reporter. Damien stared at Eleanor, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The facade had cracked, and through the cracks, Evelyn, who was sitting beside Eleanor, could finally see the monster that had been lurking there all along. The fight was far from over, but for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was a powerful weapon, and it was finally coming to light. The deposition was a bombshell. The transcript leaked to a prominent national newspaper anonymously. Of course, though, Damien's lawyers screamed Eleanor's name, sent shockwaves through the worlds of finance, society, and media. The narrative began to shift slowly at first, then with the force of a tidal wave. The image of the heartbroken, concerned husband was shattered, replaced by that of a cold, calculating eugenicist. Damien Thorne, the master manipulator, suddenly found himself on the defensive. His board of directors, once a rubber stamp for his every whim, was now in open revolt. His investors, spooked by the scandal, were pulling out in droves. The empire he had built on a foundation of ruthlessness and intimidation was beginning to crumble. But Damien was not a man to go down without a fight. He doubled down, launching a vicious, scorched earth campaign against Evelyn and Eleanor. He hired a team of public relations crisis managers who worked around the clock to spin the story, to portray him as the victim of a smear campaign. He filed a lawsuit against Eleanor for defamation, a desperate attempt to silence her. The custody hearing was set against this backdrop of chaos and recrimination. The courtroom was a media circus, a chaotic scrum of reporters and photographers, all vying for a glimpse of the warring couple. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation for the legal battle that was about to unfold. Damien's legal team came out swinging. They presented a carefully constructed case painting Evelyn as an unfit mother, a woman with a history of emotional instability who was being manipulated by a vindictive, fame-hungry lawyer. They brought in a string of witnesses, a disgruntled former nanny, a society friend whose loyalty had been bought, who testified to Evelyn's supposed failings as a wife and a future mother. It was a brutal, character-assassinating performance, and Evelyn, who was now heavily pregnant and emotionally exhausted, felt every blow. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped over her belly, and listened as her life, her character, her very soul were torn apart. But then it was Eleanor's turn, and she was magnificent. She rose to her feet, a quiet, commanding presence in the chaotic courtroom, and began to dismantle Damien's case piece by piece. She eviscerated his witnesses on cross-examination, exposing their lies, their motives, their bought and paid-for testimony. And then she began to build her own case. She presented the evidence of Damien's financial dealings, the predatory business practices, the offshore accounts. She played the recording of Catherine Royce's testimony, her voice filled with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity echoing through the silent courtroom. The centerpiece of her case, of course, was the connection to Dr. Alistair Finch. She called a series of expert witnesses, a renowned geneticist, a leading ethicist, a respected child psychologist, who testified to the profound moral and psychological implications of Damien's actions. They spoke of the dangers of designer babies, of the commodification of human life, of the narcissistic personality traits that would drive a man to such extremes. But the most powerful testimony came from a witness no one had expected. A young woman, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a fierce resolve, took the stand. It was Celeste, the personal shopper from the baby boutique. Damien's lawyers had dismissed her as irrelevant, a minor character in the drama. But Eleanor had seen something in her, a flicker of outrage, of decency, that she knew she could use. On the stand, Celeste recounted the events of that fateful day in Bon Point, her voice clear and unwavering. She told the court about Damien's arrogance, his dismissiveness, his utter contempt for his pregnant wife. And then Eleanor asked her the question that would seal Damien's fate. Celeste, after Mrs. Thorne left the store, did Mr. Thorne say anything else to you? Celeste took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on Damien, who was staring at her with a look of pure menace. Yes, she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. He said, "It doesn't matter. I have the receipts for this one, and the next one will be perfect." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The words hung in the air, a chilling testament to Damien's monstrous ego, his utter lack of humanity. He hadn't just seen Evelyn as a womb. He had seen her as a defective product, one that could be returned and replaced. The final witness was Evelyn herself. She walked to the stand, her movements slow and deliberate, her head held high. She spoke not with anger, but with a quiet, profound sadness. She told the court about her love for Damien, about the slow, painful unraveling of their marriage, about the moment she had realized that the man she had married was a stranger. She didn't need to be dramatic. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth in its simple, unadorned horror was enough. The judge's decision came 2 days later. The courtroom was packed, the air electric with anticipation. Judge Rodriguez entered, her face grim, and read her verdict in a clear, steady voice. She spoke of the sanctity of the parent-child bond, of the profound responsibility that comes with bringing a life into the world. She spoke of Damien's appalling lack of empathy, his narcissistic and controlling behavior, his utter disregard for the emotional and psychological well-being of his unborn child. And then she delivered the final devastating blow. "It is the finding of this court," she said, her gaze fixed on Damien, "that Mr. Thorne's behavior is so egregious, so profoundly contrary to the best interests of the child, that it constitutes a form of parental abandonment. Therefore it is with a heavy heart, but a clear conscience, that I hereby order the full and complete revocation of Damien Thorne's parental rights." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Damien's face was a mask of disbelief, his mouth agape. He had been so certain of his victory, so confident in his power to crush anyone who stood in his way. He had been so wrong. Evelyn burst into tears. Tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a profound, bone-deep gratitude. She had done it. She had faced the monster, and she had won. Her son, her beautiful, innocent son, was safe. The reckoning had come. And a king, a titan, a man who believed himself to be a Sor, had been brought to his knees by the quiet, unyielding power of a mother's love. The verdict landed not like a gavel, but like a detonation. The immediate aftermath was a deafening cacophony of shouting reporters, flashing camera bulbs, and the digital scream of breaking news alerts that echoed from every phone in the courtroom. For Damien Thorne, it was the beginning of a free-fall so swift and so total, it defied belief. The king had not just been checked, he had been swept from the board. The story was no longer a juicy piece of society gossip. It was a global cautionary tale. Headlines across the world screamed the news, Thorne's empire of cruelty. Parental rights revoked in shocking ruling from titan to pariah. The eugenics scandal that toppled a billionaire. His carefully constructed world shattered like spun glass. The emergency board meeting at Thorne Industries was a bloodbath. The men and women who had once fawned over him, who had laughed at his jokes and feared his displeasure, now looked at him with cold reptilian eyes. They saw not a leader, but a liability, a toxic asset that threatened to poison the entire corporation. His resignation wasn't requested. It was a foregone conclusion, a desperate act of brand preservation. The stock, once a titan of the Dow Jones, plummeted with sickening speed, erasing billions in value and wiping out the fortunes of those who had tethered their wagons to his star. Damien Thorne, the man whose name was synonymous with power, was now a pariah, a modern-day Midas whose golden touch had turned to rot. He retreated from the world, but there was no sanctuary to be found. Paparazzi hounded his every move, their long lenses capturing images of a man hollowed out by his own hubris. He was seen arguing with lawyers on a yacht in Monaco, his face a mask of purple fury. Another time he was photographed stumbling out of a high-end London bar. His bespoke suit rumpled his eyes, vacant and haunted. The aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by the stench of desperation. His final act of defiance was not a grand gesture, but a petty, vindictive war of attrition. He instructed his lawyers to fight the court-ordered child support payments, to drown Evelyn in a sea of legal paperwork, to make her pay for her victory in time, energy, and peace of mind. It was the last pathetic snarl of a pained animal proving to the world and to Evelyn that the judge's assessment had been unerringly correct. For Evelyn, the verdict brought not elation, but a profound bone-deep exhaustion, followed by the slow dawning realization of freedom. The first few days were a blur. She stayed cloistered in her small apartment, the silence a balm after the storm of the trial. Then 1 week later, under the quiet, steady glow of a hospital room lamp, her new life truly began. She gave birth to a son. Holding him for the first time was a moment of such raw, overwhelming love that it seemed to heal every wound, every scar left by Damien's cruelty. He was small and perfect, his tiny fingers curling around hers with surprising strength. She looked at his face so new and full of innocent promise, and the word perfect took on a new meaning. It wasn't about genetics or legacy. It was about this singular, miraculous being. She named him Ethan, a name that meant strong enduring a prayer and a promise for the life she would give him. In that moment, holding her son, Evelyn knew she had not just escaped a prison, but had arrived at a home she never knew she was searching for. building that home from the ground up was the next challenge. The move from the Park Avenue penthouse to a third-floor walk-up in Brooklyn was a lesson in humility and perspective. The vast empty spaces of her old life were replaced by a cozy, sunlit apartment with slightly crooked floors and the charming sounds of a real neighborhood filtering through the windows. Damien's legal games meant that money was a constant worry. There were weeks she stood in the grocery store, carefully calculating her purchases. A stark contrast to a life where private chefs had once catered to her every whim. But these struggles forged a new kind of strength in her. She learned to be resourceful to budget, to find joy not in possessions, but in experiences. Her support network, the one Damien had tried so hard to isolate her from, became her lifeline. Eleanor Vance continued to be a fierce protector in the legal realm, swatting away the petty filings from Damien's lawyers, often pro bono. Her few true friends, the ones who had seen past the diamonds, to the woman wearing them, rallied around her, bringing homemade meals, offering to babysit, and reminding her with their simple, unwavering presence that she was not alone. Slowly, she began to reclaim her own identity. She took a part-time job at a small non-profit that ran art programs for underprivileged children. The pay was a pittance compared to her old allowance, but the rewards were immeasurable. Seeing the joy on a child's face as they discovered the magic of paint, helping a shy teenager find their voice through sculpture. It was work that fed her soul in a way no shopping spree on Madison Avenue ever could. She was no longer just a vessel, a wife, or a victim. She was Evelyn. She was a mother. She was a woman with purpose. She raised Ethan in a world of love and light, a world diametrically opposed to the one his father had envisioned. Their days were filled with trips to the public library, picnics in Prospect Park, and finger-painting sessions that covered the kitchen table in a joyous mess. She read him stories about empathy and kindness, about brave heroes who were strong because they were good, not because they were rich. At night, as she watched him sleep, the thought of the future would sometimes creep in the inevitable day when he would ask about his father. The weight of that future conversation was immense, but she resolved to build a foundation of love and self-worth in him, so strong that when the truth came, it would be just a story about a sad man, not a wound that could break him. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves in the park were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, she saw a familiar face near the playground. It was Celeste, the personal shopper, pushing her own young daughter on the swings. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two women from different worlds, forever linked by a single, ugly moment in a pastel-colored store. Celeste smiled a genuine warm smile, and Evelyn smiled back. They sat on a park bench, the awkwardness quickly melting away as they fell into the easy, universal language of motherhood. They talked about teething and sleep schedules, about the joys and frustrations of raising a small child in the city. They didn't need to speak of the trial or of Damien. Celeste's presence was a quiet affirmation. It was a testament that what Evelyn had experienced was real, that her pain had been valid. In this simple, peaceful encounter, a final, quiet chapter of the ordeal found its closure. As the sun began to dip below the Brooklyn skyline, casting a warm, golden glow over the laughing children, Evelyn pulled Ethan onto her lap. He smelled of fresh air and sweet grass. She held him close, feeling the steady beat of his small heart against her own. She looked at their life, this small, imperfect, beautiful life, and a profound sense of peace washed over her. The gilded shackles of her past were gone, melted away by the enduring strength of her own spirit. This was freedom. This was joy. This new dawn was not just a promise. It was her reality, and it was more magnificent than any fairy tale. The story of Evelyn and Damien is a stark reminder that true power lies not in wealth or influence, but in courage, integrity, and the unshakable strength of the human spirit. It's a story about a woman who was pushed to the brink, who was dismissed and degraded, but who rose from the ashes of her shattered life to fight for her child and for her own soul. It's a testament to the fact that even the most formidable giants can be felled by the simple, undeniable power of the truth. If you were moved by Evelyn's journey, if you believe in the power of one person to make a difference, then please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Your support helps us to continue to tell the stories that need to be heard, the stories that inspire us, challenge us, and ultimately remind us of the very best of what it means to be human. Thank you for listening.